Thank you, Kate. Shall I start sharing my screen? Can everyone hear me okay? My audio is sometimes a bit off. Okay, great. Then I will share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay,
That's great.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying I think that the pandemic changed the way that we live and the way we work, we interact with each other. For many of us, it also changed the way that we experience space, both locally and globally. And core to this is the awareness of your body, the way that your body situates itself in space and how we feel our body in many different ways, and the way that you inhabit and move in space. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and allow you to situate yourself in space, the space that you're inhabiting right now, allow you to feel your body. Most likely everyone here is sitting in front of a screen and you're kind of back against the back of a chair. So I'd like to ask you to close your eyes and feel your feet on the ground. Feel your back on the back of the chair. Breathe in and out. First, feel the tip of your toes, sensation traveling through your feet into your heels, up into your ankles, further up through your calves, your knees, your thighs, your hips, into your stomach. Feel your stomach expanding and contracting with every breath you draw, your chest filling up with air and emptying itself of air as you inhale and exhale. Feel your fingers into your wrists, up your arms into your shoulders. Draw your shoulders up as you inhale, and then drop them down as you exhale. Feel the nape of your neck, sensation radiating up into the back of your head. Feel your eyelids on your eyes, the tip of your nose, air flowing in and out of your nose. Now visualize the space around you, its airflow into your body, your breath exhaling back into the space. Picture the extent of the space around you, the height of the ceiling above you, the distance to the walls in front and behind of you, to your left and to your right. Perhaps you can conjure up images of the textures around you, the tactile properties that they have, and what these feel like if you were to run your fingers over them. Now zoom out. Think of the room you're in the house you are in. Think of the house as it sits on your street, that street in relation to the city. Open your eyes. While you were breathing, you were focused on yourself, your view pointed inwards, aware of your body in space. It's likely that at some point you switched your mental view from a first person to a third person view, or you might have held in mind simultaneously a first person and a third person point of view, creating a tension of sorts. This tension, the tension between your body as felt from within and in space, and your body as calculated from the outside and located in space, is a tension of spatial experience, both being a body in space and having a body in space. This tension or threshold underlies a lot of my thinking and the experimental performance and allocentric view that I'm going to talk about today. Thresholds, both as literal spatial thresholds and as abstract notions, are interesting to me, as they are connectors and separators, spaces in and of themselves. Moving through thresholds means going from one space to another, a change happening. I will, in a sense, talk about thresholds as integration and dissociation, and introduce views and thinking from three different angles: cognition, architecture, and dance. At times, I will refer directly from one to the other. At times, parallels across the three are implied. To do all of this, I will use the experimental performance I designed with my colleagues Stephen Gage and Alexander Whitley at the Bartlett School of Architecture, right before the pandemic. For this, we designed a labyrinth on a floor and a camera capturing a third-person point of view, and VR goggles showing an oblique view down as one moves in the space. We were interested in questions such as, what experience might one have physically navigating space while visually seeing oneself through the eyes of a notional other? What is it like to be watching oneself, to become the observer and the observed, agent and body? What kind of liminal embodiment might arise? What is it like to be the tension, the threshold, being and having a body emphasized? In essence, rather than run experiments, we designed an enactment of ideas that one can inhabit and experience dissociation and integration as threshold. To form this, we needed to design a space. So why did we use a labyrinth? A labyrinth is a form of a complex journey dating back to Minoan times that has lots of turns. We thought that these might be difficult to navigate with one's world and body view modified, and might bring the mentioned tension to the fore. There are also mystical associations. The person walking a labyrinth is being observed by a divine third party who becomes one with the pilgrim. In a sense, a first person and third person experience in one, a tension, a threshold. Our aim was to use an immersive setup as a way of reflecting on knowledge from different disciplines, cognitive science, architecture, dance, through embodied experience. To here paraphrase the choreographer Steve Paxton, we wanted to explore some of the physical possibilities to refocus the focusing mind, time, space, gravity, opening up to creativity. Furthermore, labyrinths are also historically intimately tied to movement and dance, an important aspect within our enactment. As history has it, Ariadne's dance floor was the prototype that got Daedalus the commission to build the labyrinth at Knossos. Bringing in a simple foundation from cognitive science, we can ask what kind of representation of space and body are needed to navigate the world, and how might this representation be changed in the enactment? While of course, individual differences make experience personal for all of us, as a basis for internal representation of space and ourselves within it, the brain's cognitive map provides a framework for spatial experience that is filled with personal experience. The cognitive map is the brain's model of spatial relationships of the external world in relation to itself. The cognitive map underlies the ability to successfully navigate and perform actions in space, and it charts both what is in the world as well as what happens there. Put differently and expressed in other terms, geometry and phenomenology. Cohesive spatial representations are established by integrating both egocentric, first person, and allocentric, third person reference frames, combining many egocentric positions into an allocentric overview and so constructing an internal model of the world. An egocentric representation is where the location and orientation of objects are relative to your body. An allocentric representation is where the location and orientation are constructed with respect to other objects and environmental features independent of your body. The term allocentric was adopted in our experimental performance. However, it must be said that a truly allocentric view is actually not really possible, as no one view alone can be allocentric, and allocentric is observer independent. The cognitive map I mentioned is constructed in the wider hippocampal network, where activity in the posterior, the backside of the brain, hippocampus is sensitive to distances along a path and therefore indicates a more egocentric role. Activity in adjacent entorhinal cortex is correlated with Euclidean distance of a vector to a goal and is therefore directed at more allocentric spatial parsing. So what kind of input do our bodies rely on to construct the cognitive map? Primary modalities are in sighted individuals, vision and movement, both as translation through space and as proprioceptive movement of the body. Relevant to my interest, an important process bringing together vision and movement for cognitive mapping and navigation is known as path integration. Path integration combines egocentric information from visual feedback and idiothetic, that self-motion, cues from movement into an allocentric representation. Path integration helps to construct an always current spatial representation, as location is continually and dynamically updated by vision and movement feedback as we travel around the world. The specifics of resources available at any given time, as well as individual difference, for example, in terms of background, such as being an architect, a dancer, influence when and how egocentric or allocentric reference frames dominate. Sorry about that. There are interesting implications in terms of spatial ability. Spatial ability is not innately fixed, but it is trainable. by using one's brain in specific ways, connectivity and skill sets can be enhanced or altered. Architects or dancers have trained themselves to think about space very differently in different ways, and this might in turn influence how we experience a space. As an architect, I'm able to switch views of the world frequently. I'm able to mentally rotate the world or take different perspectives easily. It is possible that each of you constructed different views in the exercise we started with. To me, space is both the me and mine, and recalling William James, the line or threshold is difficult to draw as I negotiate and often overlay both. I hold a first person and third person view of the world in my mind quite easily. Space as me and mine requires spatial representation as a foundation for action and thinking. And operations like mental rotation and perspective taking are here key. Where mental rotation abilities allow people to hold objects in mind and rotate them so that you're able to see them from many different angles. Where perspective taking allows dynamic shifts in one's imagination to inhabit specific positions within a scene at will. Skilled navigators employ these, and for example, also in map reading. As an architect, I'm fairly good at both, and I don't need to even think about performing these operations. Our allocentric view setup would take ideas of mentally rotating or taking perspectives into an embodied realm and allow a literal enactment of reflecting on one's own functioning that entails shifting the perspective of the same agent rather than reifying different internal agents or selves regulating each other, as was suggested by Arthur Madeira, responding to the William James quote and his position that you saw earlier on the duplex nature of understanding oneself from within and from the outside. In essence, the aim was to experience how rather than splitting oneself into object and agent, one will simultaneously be agent and object. The interest lying in as much as being an agent reflecting on experience as in executing actions. An architect's or choreographer's process is an inversion of sorts of the cognitive construction process of going from egocentric to allocentric. However, even when going from an allocentric overview to egocentric experience in the planning process, architects and also choreographers often continuously loop between both. At the heart of many architectural queries is this gap between first person and third person experience. Architects notionally inhabit an external viewpoint, looking down and feeling down into nascent buildings in the design process and operating from an allocentric understanding, quasi-allocentric, to construct egocentric experiences. In doing so, we inhabit both viewpoints. We're both agent and object, both me and mine, and we shift the perspective of the same agent rather than reifying different internal agents or selves. This ability to switch from third person to first person is decisive in design thinking. But as humans experience architecture not only from a static view, but dynamically, thinking about and designing for movement as a link is key. The Swiss architect Corbusier described this experiencing space in the following way. Architecture is appreciated while on the move, with one's feet, while walking, moving from one place to another. A true architectural promenade offers constantly changing views, unexpected, at times surprising. Corbusier developed this idea inspired by himself moving through the Athens Acropolis, and then he built his first architectural promenade in this famous Villa Savoy. His description of an experience of somebody moving through a building and the way he used this in his design is different from what we otherwise often find in processes of designing a building. In the process of designing a building, we often find that concepts and tools are being used that do not place the body and, importantly, its movement at the center. And design ideas are frequently developed in plan or using simple overall concepts of arrangements, referred by the Beaux Arts term of an organizing partie pris or partie. A partie describes a relationship of parts that is notionally independent of the observer, experiencing on the ground, and thus third person in terms of spatial reference frames. As an initial idea, it is somewhat allocentric and has yet to consider first person experience. Put differently, it is conceptual but does not yet address the perceptual, which, as much as Corbusier and the modern movement have been criticized, their architecture then did achieve, as much as often their design method did achieve. Buildings that do not, in further development of a simple idea or a partie, consider dynamic inhabitation can remain static. Spaces can lack fluidity, and movement capabilities and wayfinding in buildings is impeded. Building experience can be diminished. While buildings such as the Seattle Library, which you see here, designed by OMA's diagrammatic method, include a range of interesting spaces for dwelling in, they are difficult and often not enjoyable to navigate. The Seattle Public Library has indeed required a lot of post-occupancy analyses and wayfinding improvement. A split between conception and perception has also brought about understandings of architecture as networks of relationships that allows architects and architectural theoreticians to describe architecture as a system. The philosopher Willem Flusser here suggests the architect does not design objects anymore, but relations. Instead of thinking in geometric terms, the architect has to project networks of equations. Effectively, what such avenues have in common is a shift in viewpoint and an explicit dissociation of experiential composites, a divorce of conception from perception. Overall, critiquing this conceptual approach to architecture, the philosopher Gernot Böhme suggests that buildings and spaces in reality are not freely and effortlessly available. They have to be walked through. Böhme argues for an integration of the perceptual with the conceptual, architecture designed to achieve atmosphere. Architects like Peter Zumthor are at the forefront of achieving atmospheric architecture. Architects like him often do this by inferring a first-person experience in a third-person spatial representation, such as a plan. This way, they can walk themselves around a hypothetical building after constructing it as a three-dimensional entity in their mind. Drawing on processes like perspective taking, mental rotation, or perhaps an intuitive understanding of processes such as path integration, do architects such as Zumthor or Corbusier effortlessly switch? Architects like this still draw on conceptual tools such as simple sketches or parties in the stage of design ideation, but have the ability to, even in this stage, already integrate first-person experience. Of course, architecture is not alone in the ability of switching and simultaneously inhabiting space through movement. Indeed, most architects hold fairly conceptual internal understandings of this in mind when designing space for moving bodies. Dancers and choreographers, as a contrast, approach this from a rather more perceptual perspective, designing movement of bodies itself. Working from or switching between different perspectives is a strong feature of dance practice, both in training and in the choreographic process. A choreographer often makes perspectival shifts by stepping in and out of the choreography in order to understand both the shape and affect from the outside and the feeling and functioning from the inside. Visual and self-motion feedback is an important part of dance practice, with mirrors traditionally used as a way of giving a dancer an outside eye on their movement as they're moving and switching views. This helps in achieving a desired aesthetic, such as the clean lines and alignment and postures of the body, associating an image of their body in movement with the feeling they're experiencing as they're executing it. The kinesphere, for example, is a conceptual way of understanding space around the body that helps them do this in order to visualize themselves in different ways as they are practicing or choreographing dance movements. It is composed of personal and peripersonal space and integrates all the movement potential, spatial planes and connections that are available in this process. Rudolf Laban, who's the inventor of the kinesphere, explained it as the sphere around the body whose periphery can be reached by easily extended limbs without stepping away from that place which is the point of support when standing on one foot. sorry, I'm not sure why this isn't moving on. Here we go. Expanding on the idea of the kinesphere, choreographers such as William Forsythe, who you just saw, have worked with types of body image that exist in the imagination as a way of providing creative tools for dancers to work with while improvising or creating movement material. For example, a dancer might imagine one of their previous positions or movements, freeze it in space, and use this as a basis for generating new movement by moving around the space in the imagined body it is occupying. The imagined body is occupying. Equally, this can. I'm going to mute this. Sorry. Equally, this can be done by holding in mind other volumes in space and moving in relation to them. Mental rotation and perspective taking, again, are key. Like any skill, the ability to hold images in mind while performing physical actions requires a substantial amount of practice, but becomes a powerful tool for a dancer or an architect once acquired, enabling them to execute complex cognitive tasks as they're dancing or designing. In this, they hold multiple representations of themselves in space and in mind. Setting outside of themselves and understanding of their bodies can also be explored using techniques such as contact improvisation, where an understanding of oneself through the other is formed. In this, dancers are both object and agent at once, blurring lines of me and mine to explore some of the physical possibilities by linking different sensory modalities in different ways, for linking conception of movement to sensory execution. In contact improvisation, this means modifying action in response to tactile kinesthetic information through a contact point with another person's body. So with all of this, what did we do? Using ideas and knowledge from architecture, dance, and cognition, we wanted to create a setting of both being and having a body, and see how a skilled dancer in the first instance, Tia, would navigate our labyrinth with third-person vision and first-person movement. The labyrinth in the setup was seen in two different projections in the headset. In one, the dancer observed herself in an axonometric view to reflect on the geometry of space per se. In the other view, a perspectival view to reflect on the way the human visual system sees space. In the axonometric view, while the space was viewed with true measurement, a vertical distortion of the body was seen when she moved kind of backwards from the picture plane. This was purely because of technical reasons. In the first instance, we'd asked her to travel the labyrinth from a normal view without the VR goggles, and then after that, using the VR goggles with a third-person point of view. She then navigated seeing herself from a third-person point of view with a normal perspectival view, then with this kind of quasi-axonometric view of space. In both conditions, the time spent negotiating the labyrinth stabilized after a while, shorter time taken to navigate the perspective than the time in the axonometric view. In following conversations, Tia described the sense of being in the perspective as normal, her body to her seeming to remain the same size, although visually it was diminishing the further she moved away from the camera. In both views, there were errors seen on the curving pathways and deviations often from the line of the path. This type of error became more frequent when Tia moved quickly. Sharp turns were difficult and slow, and she used, as she says, her feet like arrows. Interestingly, when information from idiothetic self-motion and the visual system diverge, there's a tendency to rely on vision over movement, and it seems even a dancer, so highly attuned with her body's movement in space, still relied heavily on vision to correct what she was doing. Following a series of runs through the labyrinth, we wanted to extend the demand on movement and include more diverse gestures. We asked Tia to go through 3 scenarios: a previously learned dance phrase, then second to learn a new movement sequence, and to play a chasing game with Alex, who was one of the people coming up with the design itself, but also Tia's choreographer. Tia first performed a dance phrase, which she was already in command of. This drew primarily on proprioceptive movement without translating through space, but she still had to maintain correct position and heading direction. She performed this competently in terms of detail of bodily movement, likely by drawing on her internal sense of movement and not needing as much visual input. Her ability to maintain her spacing, the position relative to the performance area, was compromised, her sense of direction affected by the unusual view of her body in space. Tia's ability to perform a standard ballet exercise involved balance. The adagio sequence on one leg was incredibly difficult with her vestibular system somewhat disrupted. After all of this, Alex, her choreographer, taught her a new movement phrase, which he demonstrated for her. Her ability to keep hold of information, both in movement detail and spacing, was better in this situation than in all others, illustrating just how adept she is at translating visual information by viewing a demonstrator and copying the movement without focusing on herself. The final scenario was then a chasing game. Tia chased Alex in order to capture him. They also attempted performing collaborative gestures, such as touching hands. Both novel translation and proprioceptive actions were required, and she could not use already internalized sequences of movement. Tia was here also not able to remain within a dance framework that she was highly skilled at, and we witnessed the highest experience of dissociation, with Tia moving somewhat clumsily and mixing up left and right more than in the other tasks. Our design constructed scenarios where sensory input from the visual and self-motion system are dissociated. It's interesting to see how spatially directed motor activity was curtailed, speed slowed down, and movement lacking in precision. While Tia had continuous access to visual snapshots, optic flow was modified. The visual appearance of her environment remained fixed, and she only saw her own body move. The integration of multisensory input to enable sensible action is modified, and perhaps visual idiothetic dissociation, above all, impacted path integration abilities to preserve and estimate accurate movement angles and distance ratios to reference points. When running the labyrinth, her internal sense of movement, vision and movement through space felt disjointed, especially the comparison of across versus up and down, X and Y axis of her field of view. This was heightened in this quasi-axonometric view, and Tia did not experience as high a disjointment when seeing herself in the perspective. Coming back to this work now, as we re-enter buildings and can take out work like this more easily, we hope to expand our exploration and, in thinking through our bodies and enacting knowledge, speculate on implications for architecture, dance, cognitive science, and other fields. Might we find ways to design navigation and movement that brings together a first-person and a third-person view of seeing the world in more enjoyable and somatic ways than current mapping technology or building navigation allows? What you see here on this final slide is another moment when we set up this performance and allowed people to navigate this in ways that they felt comfortable with. And there was a hand artist that wanted to try it out. And so he was able to navigate this entire setup, seeing himself the way that you see on the screen mounted in the back while navigating on his hands. So that was a rather enjoyable thing to be watching. I'd like to thank you all, and hopefully there's some feedback, some interesting thoughts that you might bring to it, or some questions you have for me on this work that is still very much in its inception and early on in thinking.